Royal Guard moves in. After Princess Charlotte orders arrest her, she attacked my little brother. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sweet scent of blooming roses filled the air. It was a rare moment of peace in the palace, where life was usually filled with rigid schedules, strict rules, and endless ceremonies. On this morning, Princess Charlotte, the young heir to the throne, decided to spend a few hours outside, away from the heavy responsibilities of court life. She wanted to enjoy something simple, something free, time with her younger brother, Prince Edward. Charlotte was a girl of 15, with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. People often said she had the same fiery temper as her mother, the Queen. But those who truly knew her also knew that beneath the surface, Charlotte had a kind heart and a protective instinct, especially when it came to Edward, who was just 10. Edward was curious, lively, and sometimes clumsy. He adored his older sister and followed her everywhere, often mimicking her gestures and listening intently to her advice. Today, they were playing a game that had become their secret tradition, racing from the rose garden to the fountain at the center of the courtyard, trying not to fall or laugh too loudly. The palace staff had grown accustomed to Charlotte's sharp temper and strong personality. They respected her, sometimes feared her, but mostly admired her intelligence and leadership. Even though she was young, she had a commanding presence. Today, however, there was no need for authority. She was just a sister enjoying time with her brother. Edward ran ahead, laughing as he tried to avoid tripping over the cobblestones. Charlotte called out to him, teasing, "Don't run too fast, you'll fall and ruin the game." Edward grinned and waved over his shoulder, pretending not to hear her warning. Nearby, Lady Margaret, a visiting noblewoman in her early 20s, strolled through the gardens with two companions. She was known for her elegance and beauty, and she carried herself with confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance. Margaret had been at the palace for several weeks, attending various court events, and her relationship with Princess Charlotte had always been a little tense. They had different personalities, Charlotte, quick-tempered and blunt, and Margaret, composed and calculating. They had exchanged polite words in the past, but there had always been an undercurrent of rivalry. Margaret enjoyed attention and often thrived in the whispers of the court, while Charlotte preferred action over gossip. As Edward darted past, he accidentally brushed against Margaret's gown. Margaret gasped in surprise, stepping back. Her companions laughed quietly, but Charlotte immediately noticed the commotion. She slowed her pace and called out sharply, "Edward, be careful!" Margaret's eyes flicked toward Charlotte, and there was a brief moment of tension. Words hung unsaid, and Charlotte could feel her pulse quicken. She didn't like the way Margaret looked at her brother. Something in her expression seemed too sharp, too deliberate. Charlotte didn't know if it was her imagination, but she trusted her instincts. Edward, oblivious to the silent tension, continued to run, his laughter ringing through the garden. Charlotte caught up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Careful, Edward. Don't push yourself too hard." He nodded but kept moving, chasing a butterfly that had landed on the fountain. Charlotte's eyes followed him, scanning the surroundings. She didn't like to feel anxious, but something about Lady Margaret's presence made her uneasy. It wasn't just the accidental brush with Edward. It was a feeling she had learned to trust, a sense that someone might be hiding their true intentions. The palace staff, moving discreetly in the background, watched the children with a mix of amusement and concern. They knew Charlotte could be fierce when she felt someone was threatening her family. But they also knew that Margaret, despite her reputation, was unlikely to cause real harm. Still, the palace was a place where appearances mattered, and Charlotte's feelings were never dismissed lightly. As Edward reached the fountain, he leaned over to touch the water, his reflection shimmering on the surface. Charlotte approached slowly, kneeling beside him to ensure he didn't slip. "You have to be careful, Edward," she said again, more gently this time. "The stones are slippery and you could get hurt." Edward smiled up at her, completely at ease, and replied, "I'm fine, Charlotte." "Don't worry so much." Charlotte couldn't help but smile, though a small part of her mind remained alert, wary of the presence of Margaret and her companions nearby. Margaret, for her part, was trying to remain calm. She did not intend to cause any trouble. She had noticed Edward's energy and Charlotte's sharp attention, and it reminded her of her own younger brother back home. But the subtle tension between the two families was like a shadow that followed every interaction, coloring even the smallest gestures. Margaret decided to retreat slightly, giving the children more space. She continued her walk through the gardens, her eyes occasionally glancing toward Charlotte and Edward, as if measuring their movements carefully. Charlotte, noticing Margaret's glance, felt her protective instincts grow stronger. She stood, brushing the dirt from her gown, and walked closer to Edward. "Stay near me," she said quietly. Edward, sensing her seriousness, nodded. The palace gardens, usually a place of leisure and peace, now felt charged with a subtle tension. Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities. What if someone was planning something harmful? What if Edward accidentally provoked someone? She was determined to prevent anything from happening. For the next few minutes, the siblings continued their game cautiously, moving from the fountain to the rose garden and back. Charlotte kept a watchful eye on everyone around them, including the palace staff and visitors. She noticed small things, the way a servant's eyes lingered too long on certain areas, the way Lady Margaret's companions whispered to each other. Charlotte's senses were sharp, trained by years of observing court life. She could feel when something was off, and she refused to ignore it. Despite the rising tension, there were moments of genuine joy. Edward laughed as he chased Charlotte around a hedge, pretending to be a knight defending a castle. Charlotte couldn't help but laugh along, her stern expression softening. In these moments, she remembered why she cherished time with Edward above all else. He reminded her of simplicity and honesty, of a world outside the expectations and pressures of the palace. But even in her laughter, the shadow of unease lingered, a reminder that life in the palace was rarely simple for long. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The gardens were now filled with the soft hum of activity, servants tending to flowers, birds fluttering between trees, and distant sounds of palace life echoing from the corridors. Charlotte and Edward paused to rest under a large oak tree, the shade providing relief from the warm sun. Charlotte pulled Edward close and whispered advice about carefulness and awareness. Edward listened intently, his wide eyes reflecting trust and admiration for his older sister. It was in this moment of calm that the first spark of conflict appeared. Edward, curious and impulsive, ran toward a small patch of flowers near Lady Margaret. In his excitement, he tripped and stumbled, colliding with Margaret's gown once again. The brush was gentle, but it was enough to draw a startled reaction. Margaret gasped, her composure breaking for a brief moment. Charlotte's heart raced, her protective instincts firing immediately. She clenched her fists and stepped forward, her mind spinning with the possibilities of what had just happened. Charlotte's sharp gaze met Margaret's. In that instant, a silent accusation hung in the air. It was more than just the accidental brush. It felt deliberate to Charlotte, a threat to her brother's safety. Her mind raced, recalling every previous interaction with Margaret, every subtle slight, every whispered conversation in the palace corridors. To Charlotte, this was not merely an accident. It was an attack, and she could not ignore it. She was determined to act to protect Edward at all costs. The garden, which had felt so peaceful just moments before, suddenly seemed tense, almost alive with anticipation. Princess Charlotte's sharp eyes followed every movement of Lady Margaret as she quickly adjusted her gown after Edward's accidental stumble. Margaret's gasp had been small but unmistakable, a sound that had echoed in Charlotte's mind like a warning bell. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a minor mishap, an innocent accident, but Charlotte could not ignore it. She had always been protective of Edward, and her instincts told her that something was not right. Edward, still unaware of the tension he had caused, looked up at Charlotte with wide, trusting eyes. "I didn't mean to bump into her," he said, brushing the dirt from his knees. His voice was light, innocent, filled with the natural honesty of a child. Charlotte's heart softened for a moment, but the sense of danger remained. She bent down to help him stand and said firmly, "I know, Edward, but you must be careful. Some people aren't as kind as you think." Edward nodded obediently, sensing the seriousness in her tone, even if he didn't fully understand it. Lady Margaret, on the other hand, had regained most of her composure. She looked at Charlotte and Edward, her expression carefully neutral, almost polite. "I hope the young prince is unharmed," she said, her voice smooth and calm. There was no hint of apology in her words, only careful civility. Charlotte bristled at the tone, interpreting it as deliberate, as if Margaret were trying to downplay the incident while sending a subtle message that she was untouchable. Charlotte's protective instincts flared even more. She could feel her face flush with anger, her heart beating faster. The The palace staff, who had been quietly observing from a distance, exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Charlotte's reputation well. When she felt someone had wronged her family, especially her younger brother, she could become fierce and unyielding. Even the most experienced guards and aides were careful not to underestimate her determination. Today, it seemed, that determination had been triggered. Whispers spread quietly among the staff. "Charlotte will not let this go," one said. Another added, "Margaret should be careful, the princess does not forgive easily." Charlotte stood, her small frame radiating authority despite her young age. She placed a protective hand on Edward's shoulder and looked directly at Margaret. "You attacked my brother," Charlotte said, her voice steady but sharp. The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Margaret's companion stiffened, and even the palace staff froze, unsure of what would happen next. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her usually composed face. She had not expected such a direct confrontation from the princess. I did no such thing," Margaret replied quickly, her voice still calm but carrying a hint of defensiveness. "The boy tripped and stumbled into me. It was an accident." Her words were measured, precise, carefully chosen to maintain her dignity, but Charlotte did not waver. She had seen enough in court life to recognize when someone was trying to cover up something, even slightly. Her instincts screamed that Margaret's story was not entirely honest, that there was more behind the stumble than mere accident. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "You think I am foolish enough to believe that?" she asked, her tone cold and commanding. Edward clung slightly to her side, sensing the tension but trusting his sister's judgment. Margaret's companions shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm that was about to break. The palace, usually a place of careful protocol and measured words, was suddenly charged with raw emotion. Charlotte, young though she was, exuded a sense of authority that made even adults pause. The guards, who had been lingering nearby, took notice of the rising tension. They were trained to respond to the princess's commands instantly, and they could sense that something serious was unfolding. Charlotte's voice, though calm now, carried an unmistakable edge of command. She turned to the nearest guard and said clearly, "Arrest her." "She attacked my little brother." The words were sharp, decisive, leaving no room for doubt or delay. The guards stiffened, their training kicking in. They moved toward Margaret, prepared to follow the princess's orders without question. Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "Arrest me for what? It was an accident," she protested, her voice rising slightly. Her companions stepped forward, attempting to intervene, but the guards held firm. The palace staff, who had gathered nearby, whispered among themselves. The word arrest in the palace context was serious. It meant immediate confinement and investigation. Even a noblewoman of Margaret's standing was not above the law if the princess demanded it. Charlotte, standing tall and resolute, did not flinch. She had always believed in fairness, but she also believed in protecting those she loved. Edward's safety mattered more to her than protocol or fear of court gossip. She watched as the guards approached Margaret, their steps measured but firm. Margaret, realizing that Charlotte's command was absolute, slowly raised her hands in surrender. She was careful not to make sudden movements, knowing that any wrong step could escalate the situation further. The palace courtyard seemed to hold its breath as the guards led Margaret away. The sound of footsteps echoed against the stone walls, and the staff followed quietly, curious and apprehensive. Charlotte remained with Edward, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, confused and slightly worried. "Charlotte, what's happening?" he asked softly. Charlotte knelt beside him, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Don't worry, Edward," she said gently. "Everything will be fine. We just need to make sure everyone tells the truth." Her words were meant to comfort him, but inside she felt a mixture of anger, protectiveness, and determination. She knew the next few hours would be crucial. The palace was a place where rumors spread quickly, and any misunderstanding could turn into scandal if not handled carefully. Charlotte had to act swiftly and wisely, despite her young age. The guards brought Margaret into a small chamber near the palace interior, a secure room used for detaining individuals until questions could be asked. Margaret's companions followed, their expressions anxious but respectful. The room was quiet, the tension thick. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but even she could feel the weight of the princess's anger. Outside the room, Charlotte and Edward waited, accompanied by a few trusted palace aides. The situation was delicate. Charlotte understood that while she had acted decisively, she also needed to ensure justice was served correctly. The Queen, alerted to the incident by palace messengers, quickly made her way to the garden. She was a composed, authoritative figure, but even she could sense the unusual tension in the air. Seeing Charlotte standing protectively next to Edward, the Queen approached carefully. "Charlotte," she said softly, "what has happened?" Charlotte turned, her expression serious but respectful. "Mother, Margaret attacked Edward. I ordered the guards to take her in," she explained, her voice steady. The Queen's eyes widened slightly, realizing that her daughter had acted on instinct rather than waiting for full confirmation. The Queen placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "I understand why you acted, but we must be careful. Accidents happen. We need to hear Margaret's side before we make any judgment." Charlotte nodded, understanding her mother's wisdom, but she could not shake the feeling that Margaret had acted deliberately. Edward, sensing the discussion, clung slightly to his sister, his trust in her unwavering. Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to balance her protective instincts with the need for fairness. Meanwhile, Margaret sat quietly in the chamber, reflecting on the sudden turn of events. She had never imagined that an innocent stumble could result in an arrest order from the princess herself. Her mind raced with thoughts of how to explain the incident without causing offense or scandal. Margaret knew that the palace was a place where perception mattered as much as reality. One wrong word could damage her reputation permanently. She remained calm, carefully considering her response, but the tension was undeniable. Outside, the palace staff whispered and speculated. Some felt sympathy for Margaret, believing it to be an unfortunate accident. Others sided with Charlotte, trusting the young princess's instincts and protective nature. Rumors began to spread, each retelling adding subtle exaggerations. Charlotte, aware of the whispers, kept a firm hold on Edward's hand. She understood the palace's ways and knew that words alone could shape opinion as much as action. As the morning gave way to early afternoon, the situation remained unresolved. Charlotte and Edward remained close, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. Charlotte's mind worked quickly, thinking of every possibility, preparing for every outcome. She knew that in the palace, nothing could be taken lightly. Even a small accident could ripple into something much larger if handled poorly. And she was determined that Edward would remain safe, no matter what it took. By the time the sun reached its peak, the palace was fully aware of the incident. Guards had secured the area, staff were on alert, and whispers of Charlotte's decisive action filled the halls. Margaret remained in the chamber, waiting for the investigation to begin. Charlotte, standing beside Edward, reflected on the events. She had acted to protect her brother, but she also understood the importance of fairness and truth. The day had started with laughter and play, and now it was filled with tension, uncertainty, and the first lessons of responsibility for a young princess. In the midst of it all, Charlotte remained steadfast. She knew the coming hours would test her patience, her judgment, and her ability to balance heart and duty. But one thing was certain. She would not let anything harm Edward, and she would see the truth revealed, no matter how complicated the path became. The palace halls, which had always been filled with the soft hum of daily activity, now buzzed with a tense energy. Word of the morning's incident had spread quickly, and everyone, from the kitchen staff to the senior advisors, was quietly discussing what had happened in hushed tones. Even the usually calm courtiers were exchanging worried glances. Princess Charlotte, still holding Edward's hand, walked through the corridors with a quiet determination. Though she was only 15, her expression carried the seriousness of someone much older. She knew that the morning's events were only the beginning of what could become a complicated matter. Edward followed closely, his small hand wrapped in hers. He trusted his sister completely, and while he didn't understand all the implications of what had happened, he could sense that the palace was unusually tense. "Charlotte," he whispered softly, "will Margaret be okay?" Charlotte knelt to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I don't know yet, Edward. We have to let the adults talk and find out the truth." "But don't worry, you're safe with me." Edward nodded, reassured by her words, though a flicker of worry remained in his young eyes. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret sat in the small chamber, alone for now, reflecting on the sudden turn of events. She was calm on the outside, but her mind raced with questions and concerns. How had a small accident escalated so quickly? Why had Princess Charlotte reacted so strongly? Margaret had always been careful to maintain her composure and reputation at court, but this incident was different. It involved the princess herself, and in the palace, anything involving royalty carried serious weight. Margaret understood that even an innocent misunderstanding could have lasting consequences if handled poorly. The queen, aware of the delicate nature of the situation, arrived in the garden to speak with her daughter. She was composed, regal, and confident as always, yet she could sense the storm brewing in Charlotte's young mind. "Charlotte," she said gently, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder, "I understand why you acted quickly. But we must make sure we know all the facts before we make any final decisions. Margaret deserves the chance to explain herself." Charlotte nodded, though her eyes remained sharp, reflecting her inner conflict. She had acted out of love and instinct, but she understood the queen's wisdom. This was her first true lesson in leadership, how to balance instinct with fairness. The palace guards had brought Margaret's companions into a nearby room where they were questioned one by one. The staff who had been present in the garden were also asked to recount what they had seen. Each witness offered slightly different details, some emphasizing Edward's stumble as an accident, others noting Margaret's startled reaction. The varying accounts made it difficult to know the full truth, and the tension in the palace grew. Charlotte listened carefully to the discussions from a distance, her mind analyzing each word, each expression. She had always been observant, but this situation required her to think with both her heart and her head. As the inquiry continued, Charlotte began to realize that the palace was a place where perception mattered as much as reality. Every gesture, every word could be interpreted in multiple ways. She thought about the way Margaret had looked at Edward, the way she had spoken, and even the smallest actions of her companions. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by palace etiquette and political strategy, and she knew that navigating these situations required both courage and careful thought. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her young shoulders. This was more than just protecting her brother. It was about understanding the delicate balance of truth, perception, and justice. Edward, sensing the serious atmosphere, remained quiet beside his sister. He watched as palace officials moved through the halls, whispering and taking notes. Despite his young age, he could feel that something important was happening, though he did not fully understand the details. He looked up at Charlotte, seeking comfort and guidance. Charlotte knelt to his level again, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We have to be patient, Edward," she said softly. "Everything will be explained soon. For now, we just wait and stay calm." Edward nodded, his trust in his sister unwavering. Back in the chamber, Margaret was finally allowed to speak. She explained her side of the story calmly and clearly, emphasizing that Edward had stumbled into her accidentally. She spoke with measured words, careful to avoid offense while maintaining her innocence. "I did not mean to cause any harm," she said, her eyes steady. "It was a simple accident, nothing more." Her voice was calm, but Charlotte, observing from nearby, could see the subtle tension in her hands and the way her shoulders stiffened. Charlotte wondered if Margaret's composure was natural or an act to maintain control in a difficult situation. The palace advisors and senior staff listened carefully, taking notes and exchanging quiet whispers. They knew that Princess Charlotte's reaction had been strong, but they also understood her protective instincts. The young princess was fiercely loyal to her family, and her actions reflected her desire to keep her brother safe. Yet in the palace, even a small mistake or misunderstanding could escalate into a larger issue if not handled with care. The advisors discussed the situation quietly, weighing the evidence, the witnesses' accounts, and the statements made by both Charlotte and Margaret. Charlotte observed everything with keen attention. She noticed how the guards reported each detail, how the staff described the events, and how Margaret maintained her composure. She realized that leadership was not only about action, but also about understanding the truth, listening to others, and making decisions based on facts rather than assumptions. This was a lesson she would remember for the rest of her life. She also felt a growing sense of empathy, realizing that Margaret, despite their differences, was also human and capable of fear, confusion, and concern. As the investigation continued into the afternoon, the tension in the palace did not diminish. Courtiers whispered quietly in the corridors, servants exchanged worried glances, and even the birds in the garden seemed to sense the unusual atmosphere. Charlotte and Edward remained close, their bond stronger than ever. Edward clung to his sister, feeling safe despite the uncertainty around them. Charlotte, in turn, felt a mix of protectiveness and responsibility. She knew that what happened today was only a small part of the lessons she would face as a future leader. Protecting her brother was important, but understanding fairness, patience, and judgment was equally vital. The Queen called for a private meeting with Charlotte, Edward, and a few trusted advisors. In the quiet of the palace chamber, away from the eyes of the staff and courtiers, she spoke gently but firmly. "Charlotte," she said, "you have shown courage and loyalty, but leadership is also about understanding others. Margaret may not have meant to harm Edward. We must be careful not to act solely on instinct, even when our feelings are strong." Charlotte listened carefully, absorbing every word. She understood her mother's wisdom, but also felt the weight of her own emotions. Her heart wanted to protect Edward, but her mind knew the importance of justice and patience. During the meeting, Charlotte asked questions, listened to explanations, and carefully considered each perspective. She realized that leadership was more complicated than she had imagined. It required thinking beyond immediate emotions, considering the consequences of actions, and balancing care for loved ones with fairness to others. She also recognized that misunderstandings could escalate quickly in a place like the palace, where appearances and reputation were everything. Charlotte's young mind worked tirelessly, analyzing the events, the words, and the reactions she had observed throughout the morning and afternoon. By evening, the palace had reached a tentative understanding. Margaret's statements were considered credible, but Charlotte's concerns were acknowledged. The situation was far from resolved, but the immediate tension had lessened. Guards returned to their usual duties, staff resumed normal activity, and the quiet hum of palace life slowly returned. Charlotte, however, remained vigilant. She knew that even when things seemed calm, underlying tension could remain, and she was determined to ensure that her brother was safe and that the truth was respected. As the sun began to set, casting warm golden light through the palace windows, Charlotte and Edward walked quietly through the gardens once more. The day had been long and filled with lessons. Charlotte reflected on the events, her mind balancing the emotions of protectiveness with the rational thinking of fairness. Edward skipped ahead occasionally, still full of energy, and Charlotte found herself smiling despite the tension. She realized that life in the palace would always be filled with challenges, but facing them with care, courage, and wisdom was what made her strong. The events of the day left a lasting impression on both Charlotte and Edward. Charlotte had learned about the delicate balance of justice, perception, and responsibility. Edward, though young, had experienced the protective love of his sister and the importance of patience and understanding. Margaret, too, had been reminded that even careful actions could be misinterpreted in a sensitive environment like the palace. The day had been a lesson for everyone involved, that truth, patience, and empathy were just as important as courage and instinct. By nightfall, the palace returned to its usual calm. Charlotte sat beside Edward in the quiet of their chamber, reflecting on the lessons of the day. She understood that her instincts had been right to protect her brother, but she also knew that understanding others and seeking the truth was essential. She looked at Edward, smiling softly. "We'll face challenges together, Edward," she said quietly. "And we'll always do what's right." Edward smiled back, feeling safe and loved, unaware of the complexities of the world around him, but trusting completely in his sister. The next morning, the palace stirred with a quiet but urgent energy. The corridors, usually filled with the soft rhythm of daily life, now carried whispers and cautious glances. Everyone seemed aware that the previous day's incident between Princess Charlotte and Lady Margaret had left ripples throughout the court. The air was thick with anticipation as the staff, guards, and courtiers all prepared for what promised to be a formal investigation. Even the birds in the garden seemed to chirp with extra urgency, as if sensing the heightened tension in the palace. Charlotte, dressed in her usual elegant attire, walked beside Edward, who clutched her hand tightly. He had slept poorly, his mind still swirling with questions about what had happened. Charlotte, on the other hand, had spent much of the night thinking carefully about the steps ahead. She knew that the investigation would not just decide Margaret's fate, but could also affect how the court viewed her own actions. It was a delicate balance, protecting her brother while remaining fair and reasonable. The first to arrive at the chamber for questioning were the palace guards who had been present in the garden. Each guard was asked to recount exactly what they had seen, step by step. Their testimonies were detailed, noting not only the physical actions of Edward and Margaret, but also the timing, the surrounding environment, and even the reactions of other staff and visitors. Charlotte listened closely, absorbing every word. She noticed small details the adults might have overlooked. The exact moment Edward stumbled, the way Margaret's hand had moved instinctively, the subtle expressions on the faces of her companions. Every detail mattered. Next, the palace staff who had been near the scene were summoned. They spoke quietly, aware of the importance of their statements. Some described Edward's stumble as clumsy but innocent, while others mentioned that Margaret had reacted with visible surprise. There were small discrepancies between the accounts, as is natural when many people witness the same event. Charlotte, though young, had learned the importance of analyzing multiple perspectives. She understood that truth could be complicated, and that fairness required careful listening and patience. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret remained calm as she was brought before the Council of Senior Advisors. Her expression was composed, her posture upright, showing confidence even in an unfamiliar and stressful situation. She began to explain her side of the story once again, emphasizing that the collision with Edward had been accidental. She spoke clearly, carefully choosing words that would convey innocence without sounding defensive. "I had no intention of harming the young prince," she said firmly. "It was a simple accident, and I hope we can clarify what really happened." Charlotte observed Margaret closely, studying her expressions, her tone, and her gestures. She was trying to understand whether Margaret was sincere or if there was more to the story than met the eye. It was difficult to know for certain, but Charlotte had always trusted her instincts. She could feel a mix of caution and curiosity as she considered Margaret's explanation. She also felt a growing responsibility, not just to Edward but to the court and the palace. Decisions made here could set precedents for fairness, justice, and trust. As the investigation progressed, the advisors asked questions designed to clarify the sequence of events. They examined the timeline, cross-referenced the statements, and considered possible motives. Charlotte listened quietly, her mind working quickly to understand the broader implications. She realized that even in situations that seemed simple, misunderstandings could escalate quickly. The palace was full of careful observers, each with their own interpretations and biases. Charlotte knew that her role, even as a young princess, was to separate emotion from fact as much as possible. Edward, who remained beside Charlotte throughout the questioning, was quiet but attentive. He occasionally glanced at Margaret, curiosity and concern mingling in his young eyes. Charlotte bent down to reassure him. "Stay calm, Edward," she whispered softly. "We just need to listen and learn the truth." Edward nodded, drawing strength from her words. He trusted his sister completely and felt safe despite the tense environment. Charlotte took a deep breath, understanding that her calm demeanor was crucial not only for her brother, but also for the advisors and witnesses present. The council requested that security footage and garden surveillance be reviewed. Although the palace was a place of tradition, it also had modern measures in place to ensure safety. The footage showed Edward running toward the fountain, his small steps quick and unsteady. It showed the moment he stumbled and the brief collision with Margaret's gown. Charlotte watched carefully, noting the expressions on everyone's faces and the precise movements of all involved. The footage confirmed that Edward had indeed tripped, but it also highlighted Margaret's startled reaction. Charlotte considered the sequence carefully, balancing her instinctive protectiveness with the evidence before her. The advisors then examined Margaret's companions, questioning them about what they had seen and how Margaret had responded. The companions emphasized that Margaret had reacted instinctively, surprised by Edward's sudden movement, and had made no attempt to harm him. Their statements aligned with the surveillance evidence, supporting the claim that the incident had been accidental. Charlotte's mind weighed every detail, understanding that fairness required considering all perspectives, even when her protective instincts urged immediate action. As the hours passed, Charlotte began to feel a sense of both frustration and enlightenment. She was frustrated because she had wanted to act immediately to protect Edward, and yet she realized that patience and careful consideration were equally important. She was enlightened because she understood the complexity of leadership and responsibility. Protecting someone she loved was not only about immediate action, it was also about seeking the truth, understanding intentions, and ensuring that justice was served fairly. Meanwhile, Margaret remained composed. She had maintained a polite but firm demeanor throughout the questioning, showing patience and respect for the process. Charlotte observed her closely, noticing moments when Margaret's eyes softened slightly, as if expressing relief that the investigation was taking place. Charlotte realized that Margaret was human, capable of fear, honesty, and concern, just like anyone else. It was a lesson in empathy for the young princess, a reminder that even those who seemed like rivals could have genuine feelings and intentions. The advisors deliberated quietly after hearing all the evidence. They weighed the testimonies, considered the surveillance, and reflected on the intentions behind each action. Charlotte listened closely, understanding that leadership required careful judgment and measured decisions. She thought about the consequences of labeling the incident as intentional versus accidental, and how such a judgment could affect not only Margaret, but also the trust within the palace and among the staff. Finally, the advisors called Charlotte and Edward forward to share the outcome. The room was silent as the council spoke. After careful consideration, the head advisor began, it appears that the incident was accidental. Lady Margaret did not intend to harm Prince Edward. All evidence and testimonies support this conclusion. Charlotte felt a mix of relief and lingering caution. She had trusted her instincts to protect Edward, but she also understood that fairness and evidence must guide her decisions. Charlotte nodded, acknowledging the council's decision. She understood that her responsibility was not only to her brother, but also to the palace and the principles of justice. Edward, sensing the relief, smiled up at his sister. Charlotte returned the smile, feeling a sense of calm and accomplishment. She had learned an important lesson. Protecting loved ones required courage, but understanding and fairness were equally essential. By evening, the palace had returned to its usual rhythm. Staff resumed their duties, courtiers whispered quietly, and the gardens, once tense, now seemed calm again. Charlotte walked with Edward through the garden, reflecting on the events of the day. She realized that leadership and responsibility were not about acting quickly alone. They were about listening, understanding, and making decisions with both heart and mind. Edward skipped ahead, his energy renewed, and Charlotte felt a quiet pride in her ability to balance protection with fairness. The day ended with lessons learned for everyone involved. Charlotte had grown in understanding and patience, recognizing the complexity of human actions and intentions. Edward had witnessed the protective love of his sister and the importance of calm in uncertain situations. Margaret had been reminded of the delicate balance of perception, reputation, and honesty in the palace. And the palace itself had seen how even small events could ripple into larger lessons about trust, responsibility, and understanding. As night fell, Charlotte and Edward sat quietly by the fountain, the water reflecting the moonlight. Charlotte placed a gentle hand on her brother's shoulder. "We've learned a lot today, Edward," she said softly. "Sometimes things happen that are not what they seem. We must always be careful, patient, and fair." Edward nodded, looking up at her with admiration and love. Charlotte smiled, knowing that the bond between them had grown stronger and that the lessons of patience, understanding, and justice would stay with her forever. The morning after the investigation began with a calm that felt almost unreal in the palace. The previous days had been filled with tension, confusion, and uncertainty, and now there was a quiet sense of relief among the staff and courtiers. Princess Charlotte and Prince Edward moved through the corridors together, their steps measured, but their bond stronger than ever. The events that had unfolded had tested not only Charlotte's instincts, but also her ability to balance emotion with reason. Though the air was calmer, the lessons of the past few days remained vivid in her mind. Charlotte glanced down at Edward, who was skipping slightly beside her, his youthful energy barely contained. He looked up at her with wide eyes, full of trust and curiosity. "Charlotte, will everything be okay now?" he asked softly. Charlotte smiled gently, bending down to meet his gaze. "Yes, Edward," she said. "Everything is okay, but we've learned that sometimes we must be patient and careful even when we feel strongly. That is part of growing up and leading well." Edward nodded, absorbing her words. Though young, he was learning the meaning of responsibility and trust from his older sister, lessons that would stay with him for years to come. In the palace garden, Lady Margaret walked slowly, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. She had been released following the investigation, which had concluded that the collision with Edward had been accidental. Relief washed over her, though she could not ignore the lingering tension that remained between her and Princess Charlotte. Margaret understood that the princess's protective instincts were strong, and though the situation had been resolved fairly, she recognized the depth of Charlotte's loyalty to her brother. Margaret walked through the gardens quietly, reflecting on how misunderstandings could escalate quickly in a place where appearances and perception were so important. Charlotte, meanwhile, remained attentive to every detail around her. She walked through the palace corridors with Edward, noticing the subtle changes in the staff's expressions, the careful whispers that now seemed more curious than accusatory, and the way the palace returned to its rhythm. Though the immediate crisis had passed, Charlotte understood that leadership was an ongoing responsibility. She had learned that protecting someone she loved required both courage and careful thought. It was not enough to act solely on instinct. Understanding, patience, and fairness were just as important. Later that day, the Queen requested a private audience with Charlotte and Edward. In the quiet of her private chambers, she spoke gently but firmly. "Charlotte, you acted out of love and protection, which shows the strength of your character," the Queen said. "But remember, leadership also requires understanding and fairness. Today, you have learned the importance of balance. Courage without patience can lead to misunderstandings, and wisdom without compassion can leave hearts unguarded." Charlotte listened intently, absorbing every word. She understood her mother's message fully. She had acted to protect Edward, but she also needed to understand the perspectives of others, even those who might seem like rivals. Edward, curious as always, spoke up. "Mother, I was scared, but Charlotte helped me. She made sure I was safe," he said. The Queen smiled, placing a hand on his head. "Yes, Edward," she said softly, "and that is a bond that will always matter. Your sister's love and guidance will help you grow strong and wise." Charlotte felt a quiet warmth in her chest, knowing that her efforts had protected her brother and strengthened their connection. The Queen's words were a reminder that family, trust, and understanding were central to the life they shared within the palace walls. As the day progressed, Charlotte took the opportunity to reflect quietly in the palace gardens. She walked slowly along the flower-lined paths, observing the swans in the fountain and listening to the birds' soft songs. Her mind replayed the events: Edward's stumble, Margaret's startled reaction, the guards' careful movements, and the careful deliberations of the advisors. She realized that every person had a perspective shaped by their experiences and intentions. Understanding that truth often had many layers was an essential lesson, one that she would carry forward in every decision she made. Margaret, too, took time for reflection. She had learned that even when one acts with the best intentions, misunderstandings can arise, especially in environments as sensitive as a royal palace. She thought about Charlotte's protective nature and her clear sense of loyalty to Edward. Though they had been at odds in the past, Margaret now understood that Charlotte's reactions came from a place of care and responsibility. The experience had taught her the importance of patience, clear communication, and the awareness that perception could influence how actions were interpreted. Back in the palace, life slowly returned to normal, though the lessons lingered. The staff moved with a quiet confidence, knowing that the crisis had passed, but also aware of the subtle lessons it had imparted. Charlotte, walking with Edward, noticed how even small interactions carried weight. A kind word, a gentle gesture, or careful attention to others. Feelings could make a significant difference in relationships and decisions. She began to understand that leadership was not only about authority or quick action. It was about empathy, observation, and thoughtful consideration. As evening approached, Charlotte and Edward returned to the garden one last time for the day. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, the light soft and warm. Edward ran ahead, chasing the shadows of the swans across the fountain, laughing freely. Charlotte watched him, a smile spreading across her face. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because she had been right or because Margaret had been found innocent, but because she had learned how to balance protection with fairness, instinct with reason, and emotion with judgment. The palace was quieting down as the sun set, and Charlotte sat on a stone bench watching Edward play. She thought about how quickly things had escalated and how easily misunderstandings could occur. She also thought about the importance of her own role as a future leader, realizing that every action she took, every word she spoke, could influence those around her. Protecting her brother had been her priority, but understanding the perspectives of others had become equally important. It was a lesson in responsibility, maturity, and empathy. Margaret, passing quietly through the garden on her way to her quarters, noticed Charlotte and Edward. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no animosity in the glance, only a mutual acknowledgement of the events that had occurred. Margaret understood Charlotte's motivations, and Charlotte recognized Margaret's intentions. The brief moment of understanding was subtle, but it marked a turning point. Both realized that while tensions and misunderstandings could arise, respect, patience, and clarity could restore balance and trust. That night, Charlotte and Edward returned to their private chambers, the palace silent around them. Edward, feeling safe and comforted, climbed into bed. Charlotte sat beside him for a while, reflecting on the day and the lessons it had brought. She understood now that true protection went beyond immediate action. It required listening, understanding, and ensuring fairness. Leadership, she realized, was not just about making decisions, but also about nurturing trust and empathy, guiding others with both strength and compassion. The days that followed saw the palace returning fully to routine. Staff and courtiers resumed their duties with renewed understanding, having witnessed the lessons Charlotte had learned firsthand. Charlotte herself carried a quiet confidence, her protective instincts balanced by patience, observation, and careful thought. Edward, playful and curious as ever, continued to trust in his sister, knowing that she would always look out for him while also teaching him important lessons about understanding and fairness. Princess Charlotte reflected often on the incident, realizing that it had been more than just a moment of conflict. It had been a powerful lesson in responsibility, empathy, and the delicate balance of leadership. She knew that future challenges would arise and that misunderstandings and conflicts would test her further. But she also understood that the values she had embraced, protection, fairness, patience, and empathy, would guide her through any situation. By the end of the week, the palace had fully regained its calm. The gardens were peaceful once more, the staff moved with ease, and the halls echoed with the gentle rhythm of normal life. Charlotte walked with Edward, observing the world around her with a thoughtful eye. She knew that life in the palace would always bring challenges, but she felt prepared. She had learned how to protect those she loved, how to seek truth, and how to act with both courage and wisdom. That night, as Charlotte finally lay down to rest, she thought of Edward and the lessons of the past days. She felt a sense of quiet pride, knowing that she had acted with love and responsibility, while also learning to temper instinct with fairness and judgment. She understood now that leadership was a journey, one that required constant learning, reflection, and growth. And as she closed her eyes, the palace around her silent and still, Charlotte knew that she was ready for the future, prepared to face challenges with both heart and mind, and guided always by the lessons of trust, empathy, and love.